please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Good evening and thanks for joining us on What's Hot, and let's go straight to the big breaking story at this hour. The Reserve Bank of India has released a statement in which it says that it is reiterating the instructions that it had sent to banks in order to strengthen the SWIFT mechanism. Now remember, the PNB fraud is linked to the fact that the junior branch officials at Punjab National Bank had not linked the SWIFT entries to the core banking system. Now, this 11,400 crore rupee Nirav Modi fraud is centered on SWIFT or Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. The Reserve Bank has also warned that it told banks as early as 17 months ago about SWIFT-related frauds. Comments came in after Finance Minister Arun Jaitley broke his silence on the matter and blames the PNB management, its auditors, and even the Reserve Bank of India as the supervisory agency. Ritu Singh joins us now with more details. Ritu, let's take our viewers through the details of the statement that's come in from the Reserve Bank of India. There are two separate issues. One, it's reiterating the instructions that it had sent in 2016 on the possible misuse of the SWIFT system. And secondly, it set up a committee headed by Mr. Malegaon to look at the divergence and the possible frauds that have taken place.
The Reserve Bank of India has reiterated, in the light of the Punjab National Bank fraud, that as part of its ongoing efforts to strengthen the supervisory framework for banks, it has been issuing instructions and warnings to banks to strengthen their operational risks, which includes, by the way, the SWIFT infrastructure. In fact, it says the risks arising from the potential malicious use of SWIFT created by banks for the genuine business needs has always been a component of the operational risk profile, and therefore on at least 3 occasions since August 2016, and I think they're also referring to a speech made by RBI Deputy Governor S.S. Mundra, in which he clearly indicated that these sort of mechanisms need to be monitored more closely. So that is what RBI is reiterating. At least 3 times since August 2016, that is, it has advised banks and warned them of such risks through its various communications, and to take steps to preempt, such occurrences. But banks, it says, have been at various levels of implementation of such measures, which means not all banks were completely compliant managing these risks as well as RBI would want them to. So in the wake of this fraud that has emerged, RBI has again reiterated in confidential instructions to banks and mandated them to implement within a given deadline the prescribed measures for strengthening the SWIFT operations, the whole environment, in fact, in the banks itself. Now, this is one part of the press release released by RBI. Yes.
Yeah, and the second part on the committee that's been set up, Ritu.
Absolutely, Shireen. If you've noticed in the last year or so, a lot of banks have been reporting very high levels of divergences, which means in the assessment of the bad loans assessed by the bank's auditors and what is then assessed by the Reserve Bank of India. So these two have been showing a lot of divergence, which is why Reserve Bank of India has now set up a committee to see why, whether or not banks are not recognizing these risks as well as the bad assets, in properly, and therefore, is there a problem with recognition? And to prevent that, it has formed a committee to look into why banks are reporting such large divergences, and that committee, as you said, will be headed by Mr. Malegaon. He's headed several committees under RBI. The committee will also comprise of members like Bharat Doshi, Mr. S. Raman from Canara Bank, Shri Nandakumar Sarvade, and several other officers of RBI. And I think the idea will be to curb and to prevent any further, great divergences in what is reported by the auditors of the bank and what is assessed by RBI as risks.
Okay, Ritu, I'll come back to you in just a second. We also have with us Mr. H.R. Khan, former Deputy Governor of the RBI. Mr. Khan, thanks very much for joining us. Here is the Reserve Bank saying that we cautioned banks thrice in 2016. In fact, I had Mr. S.S. Mundra here on record on CNBC TV18 in my interview say very clearly that in a speech that he made in 2016, he had cautioned about the misuse of SWIFT. Now, if that were the case, and clearly the Reserve Bank had enough reason to be sending out this confidential sort of missive to public sector banks, Why is it then that we're in this situation where something the size of 11,400 crore rupees of fraud that has been perpetrated using the SWIFT system has not come to light? So there seems to have been a failure on the part of the Reserve Bank, hasn't it?
No, I won't know what all has gone into after those advisories have been issued. And we had the issue of that Bangladesh case where there was a cyber fraud relating to SWIFT. We had a case of Union Bank where there was a SWIFT fraud. But here what was happening, some of the controls which were supposed to be in place were not probably in place. And when SWIFT was not integrated to CBS, there was all the more reasons to have very robust compensatory controls till such time it is integrated, and it should have been integrated in a time-bound manner. But it's a fact that in many banks, when they move to a new system, for example, Finacle 10, many banks did face the problems while switching over to the new system. So possibly that could have led to this delay in integration. But in the meantime, pending full-fledged integration, compensatory control should have been robust. I think probably RBI will look into what went wrong in terms of implementation of its advisory. Then only we'll come to know what was the issue.
So you're saying that the RBI needs to examine what went wrong. You know, we've finally heard from the finance minister. He has given his first reaction on the PNB issue, and he has held the PNB management. He's held also auditors and, of course, the supervisory agency, which in this case is the Reserve Bank, for what has gone wrong at Punjab National Bank in this Nirav Modi matter. The finance minister's argument, to put it simply, is, look, if you enjoy autonomy, then the responsibility lies at your door. How do you react to that, Mr. Khan?
No, there is always a gap in terms of mandate and the capacity to execute mandate. And fraudsters always go a few steps ahead of the controls and systems which are in place. So large, even it has happened in major banks all over the world. The bank fraud is not something which is only unique to India or only unique to public sector banks. But the fact remains, here certain basic controls were probably not put in place, maybe because they are migrating to a new system. But certainly it needs to be looked into, and I'm very happy that there is a committee under such a seasoned expert, Mr. Malegaon, has been set up to look into this. But I have slight confusion about this committee. This committee is looking at the divergences, which is a very important issue. At the same time, IT-related issues. So I'm slightly confused. But the whole idea of having Mr. Malegaon on the top of the committee is a great idea. He is an expert in that field, and he commands a lot of respect. I think that should be really. So,
Mr. Khan, given the fact that the RBI has now chosen to set up this committee headed by Mr. Malegaon to look at the issue of divergence, does that lead you to believe that we could perhaps be facing a serious problem when it comes to recognition that perhaps we are not fully out of the woods? Bankers keep telling us that the worst is behind us, and yet we see these divergence numbers. The fact that the Reserve Bank has now decided to set up this committee, does that seem to suggest that all is not right on the recognition front?
No, there are multiple issues in terms of this. Again, we gave a total go-by to consortium lending. We had multiple banking. And in many accounts, there are 15, 20, 30, 40 banks lending to the same borrower. There is no proper exchange of information. So we had this acrylic system which came into place. Second is the whole old concept was you recognize based on record of recovery in the individual bank. Whereas there may be cases that other bank has got other information and the project is not really completed. Cash flows will not come, so you recognize as NPS, which information is not available to the bank. So auditors in some banks are handicapped in terms of not having full information about that particular borrower vis-a-vis all the lenders. So there is need for some dialogue between RBI and auditors and RBI and ICI. I think Mr. Malegaon will provide that valuable link dialogue between the regulator and the auditors. And also there are some gray areas in terms of rules and interpretation. I think that needs to be smoothened, and the whole issue of this, how the IT system is being used in different banks. As you know, there is something called garbage in, garbage out, but the system is automated or there is some manipulation which happens so that you don't get the correct output and you are not in a position to generate the correct and accurate picture about the health of the accounts. So I think these are the issues which need to be looked into, and I'm sure Mr. Malegaon, given his expertise, and other members will contribute to finding a durable solution to this problem.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khan, for joining us. H.R. Khan, the former Deputy Governor there, giving us his first reaction to the committee that's been set up by the Reserve Bank of India to look at the issue of divergence, and also the Reserve Bank saying that thrice in 2016 they sent out advisories to banks about possible misuse of the SWIFT system. Remember, S.S. Mundra said exactly that here on CNBC TV18 a few days ago when he was speaking with us on the issue. And yet we're sitting at this juncture. But almost a week after the 11,400 crore rupee fraud at Punjab National Bank came to light, the finance minister has broken his silence. Speaking in New Delhi, the finance minister says the management of Punjab National Bank, its auditors and the supervisory body, which is the regulator, the Reserve Bank, are responsible for what has allegedly perpetrated by Nirav Modi and his companies. In a scathing indictment of the then PNB management, the finance minister said they have been found wanting. He went on to question the role of both the internal as well as the external auditors, questioning what were they doing. He also trained his guns at the regulator, the RBI, saying that it should introspect. Listen in to the finance minister.
The first important question is with regard to the lack of ethics that a section of Indian business follows. And therefore it is incumbent on us as a state, till the last legitimate capacity of the state, to really chase these people to the last possible conclusion to make sure that the country is not cheated. When authority is given to the managements, you are expected to utilize that authority effectively and in the right manner. And therefore a question for the managements itself is, were they found lacking? And on the face of it, the answer seems to be, yes, they were. They were found also lacking in being able to check who amongst them were the delinquents itself. The third important question is, which is addressed to our friends in the profession, what are our auditors doing? There is also an important challenge where the supervisory agencies have now to introspect as to what are the additional mechanisms they have to put into place to make sure that stray cases don't become a pattern again. I say this because these kind of developments have a cost to the country and a cost to the taxpayer. It's a direct cost. And it has an indirect cost which impinges on development, which impinges upon the lending capacity of banks as an institution, and therefore it obviously impinges upon developmental finance.
Well, that's the finance minister holding the Punjab National Bank management, the internal as well as the external auditors and the supervisory body, the Reserve Bank, asking all three to introspect. Here are the key developments of the day in the PNB fraud case. The Supreme Court has now stepped in. Chief Justice Mishra will hear a public interest litigation on this matter on Friday. Meanwhile, the CBI will get custody of the three accused in the case for the next 10 days. These were officials arrested from which allegedly is the epicenter of this scam. Time for us to head into a break, but coming up next, former Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha joins us to discuss the PNB fraud. That conversation when we return. Well, many more developments in the Punjab National Bank fraud case. Joining us now for his comments on the matter is former Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha. Mr. Sinha, I appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. You've written a piece today where you have raised 10 questions that you would like the government to answer, sir. But let me start by asking you whether you believe that this is a matter that requires a probe by a joint parliamentary committee, which is something that has happened with scams previously, or do you believe that the multi-agency probe, multi-agency investigation that is currently underway will take its own course, should take its own course?
You know, I used to believe in joint parliamentary committees until I served on the JPC of the 2G scam. And then I lost faith in joint parliamentary committees. And therefore, my suggestion would be that there should be a multi-agency investigation into this scam, which should be monitored by the Supreme Court. That will ensure that the truth comes out and falsehood is eradicated.
But why do you believe, Mr. Sinha, that this probe should be monitored by the Supreme Court? Don't you have faith in the investigative agencies that are conducting the probe currently? Why are you asking for a Supreme Court monitored probe?
No, I don't. I'll be quite frank with you. I don't, because the investigating agencies, whether it's CBI or Enforcement Directorate or Income Tax, they all have become his master's voice. And there are many, many instances to show that they are not investigating, in many cases, fairly and squarely.
Mr. Sinha, are you saying that the investigative agencies are not investing this case fairly? We've seen several raids being conducted by the Enforcement Directorate, by the CBI. The CBI has filed a fresh FIR as well. We've seen arrests being made, judicial custody being extended. Are you suggesting that the investigation in this case at this juncture is wanting?
In this case also, let me just point out one thing which I mentioned in my article, that somebody has put out the total value of goods seized. Now, there was a social media joke that RBI is still counting the seized demonetized currency. It's still counting the currency. And here, within seconds, the agencies come to the conclusion of the value, regarding the value of the goods seized. Now, who are they trying to help? I have said that ruling party spokespersons are now claiming, what is this 11,400 crore? We already have recovered 5,000 crore or more, and the rest will also be recovered. So what is all this hullabaloo about? So who is letting out these figures? That itself shows that there is less than.
Who is the Enforcement Directorate, sir? The Enforcement Directorate has on record put out the numbers that you mentioned, the numbers that you allude to in terms of the seizures.
So why are they putting out this number? What are they trying to prove? Are they going by the listed price of the jewelry, the diamonds? Are they going by the purchase price? Which price are they mentioning? And I understand that many of these the diamonds are fake. They are artificial diamonds, not natural diamonds.
If I hear you correctly, Mr. Sinha, are you suggesting that the narrative that then is being built around the seizures and the value of the seizures is to make it look like the recovery in this matter has happened and hence there is no scam at all? Do you believe that that is the narrative that's being built? Is that what you're suggesting?
Ultimately, this is what it will lead to. That, okay, 11,400, we don't know this final figure yet, but let's say it was 11,400 crore. So 11,400 crores was swindled and the equal amount of money or more has been recovered from the assets of the scamsters. So fair and square, the whole thing is over.
You know, Mr. Sinha, you say in your piece that the responsibility must lie at the door of the Finance Ministry and the Finance Minister. But if I could, sir, take you back to a matter that pertains to your tenure as Finance Minister, and that was the debacle of UTI and US 64. At that point in time, you had very categorically stated that the then UTI chairman had kept the government in the dark, that the government and the Finance Ministry did not know what had transpired with US 64, and hence you couldn't be held responsible for what happened. Why wouldn't you give the same benefit of doubt to the current Finance Minister and the current officials in the Finance Ministry?
For the very simple reason that we had no member on the board of the UTI. UTI was functioning as a completely independent organization at that point of time. But because UTI was UTI, I was held responsible as Finance Minister. And in this particular case, Punjab National Bank is a public sector bank. Government and RBI have directors on the boards of public sector banks. There is a Finance Ministry representative on the board of the public sector banks, And the point that I have made in that article is that ultimately who is responsible for answering questions in Parliament for public sector banks? It is the finance minister. So who should then carry the can when something like this happens? The finance minister. I have made the point that it is not possible for a finance minister to supervise the functioning of banks or any other institution on a day-to-day basis. But having said that, I'll also emphasize that he or she cannot escape the constitutional and democratic responsibility for what has happened. Ultimately, the responsibility will lie at the door of the minister in charge, if not at the door of the whole government.
Well, the finance minister has spoken and asked the supervisory body, the Reserve Bank, to introspect, and also held the Punjab National Bank management as well as its auditors responsible for what's happened. But let me end then by asking you, sir, where do we go from here? You talked about not having faith in the Joint Parliamentary Committee process. We've had several committees, several recommendations. The Reserve Bank has issued circulars, etc., on how to strengthen the monitoring system to avert a situation like this. But do you believe that at the end of all of this, unless you take the difficult decision on bringing down government stakeholding in public sector banks, this issue will continue?
In theory, I am not in agreement with this thesis that the private sector is all clean and the private sector banks, if the banks are nationalized or they are privatized, then scams will not happen. We are aware of the fact the Harshad Mehta scam, the Ketan Parikh scam, they took place in cooperative banks, even in private sector banks. So that in itself is not important. The ownership is not important. The responsibility for supervision for banking operations, whether the cooperative banks or public sector banks or private banks or foreign banks for that matter, lies with the Reserve Bank of India. And it's the Reserve Bank of India which should have found out this scam, especially because the transactions involved a foreign exchange.
So you believe that the RBI is also wanting in this issue. We're completely out of time, sir. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18 with your thoughts. That's the former Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha on the questions he wants the government to answer in the PNB fraud case. It's a wrap on this edition of What's Hot. Markets out of steam in the last hour of trade. The market action coming up next on Markets Today Talkback. I'll see you again in 30 minutes on India Business Hour.